feather picking or self-mutilation problems is probably one of the most common syndromes or common problems that board-certified avian veterinarians see. In my practice, we'll probably see at least one or more new cases of those problems every day that we see patients. It's not uncommon for us to see several cases every day. They're problems that have plagued birds, especially since the early 90s, and I would say that that's a pivotal time in the disease problem, because really the birds who were taken out of the wild and imported were not nearly as likely to have those problems. It's not that they never had them, but there was an explosion of self-mutilation and feather damaging behavior once the end of importation came. So most of these birds come in as young birds. They're not baby birds, but they're very often between 1 year and 2 years of age when they begin the behavior. They almost always have development of picking patterns that goes along with the species. African greys, for example, start out picking a ring of feathers around their neck, and then it spreads down their chest. Macaws typically start picking their lower legs, as do some other birds. Eclectus pick their chest and their backs. Cockatoos pick and lovebirds pick the inside of their wings, their axilla, their what's called their propatagium, the piece of skin that extends from their shoulder to their carpus. And it starts in those sorts of areas, but then once those feathers are, picked more and more, then the area that they pick spreads. What we see in these birds is that these birds aren't picking because their skin bothers them, by the way. They're picking because when they pull that feather, they get some positive reward from doing that. And so it's like any behavior. Behaviors are done because they give you a positive reward. And so you have to ask yourself a little bit like, what could possibly be positive by hurting yourself by pulling these feathers? And the answer is that when these birds pull feathers, they startle themselves, and they get a little dose of epinephrine as a result. So what we think happens with most of these birds is that the underlying disease that leads to their feather destructive behavior is already present, and they discover how to treat themselves on one day. So one day this African gray chick who's 1 year or 2 years old is grooming himself, and he's up here grooming these feathers around his neck where it's challenging for him to groom his feathers, and he accidentally pulls one too hard. When that happens, it's painful and it startles him, and his adrenal glands go off as a result. And it's that little dose of epinephrine that he gets, that little dose of adrenaline that he gets when he hurts himself, that changes something about him and makes him feel better. That's the reward. Why is that happening? Well, what we think is happening, and I think that I feel quite certain that this is the answer, but it's one of those things that's hard to prove, is that during the development in these birds, when we quit importing pet birds out of the wild, with the start of the CITES laws in January of 1990, we started breeding everything from in captivity. What we saw with hand raising birds is that there was some developmental step that was lost in those birds. So that shouldn't come as a big surprise to us, because there were articles published as early as the 1920s that if you hand raised a number of different primate species, that you'd result in these animals who had obsessive compulsive behaviors, especially self-mutilation behaviors. We found out in the 1940s, if you hand raise puppies away from their parents, that you get all these obsessive compulsive behaviors. In their case, things like bed sucking or licking themselves and getting what are called acral lick granulomas, where they lick their skin to the point where they get a lesion on their skin. We found out that cats who are hand raised have obsessive compulsive behaviors, what we call blanket suckers or sweater suckers. We found out that horses who are hand raised have obsessive compulsive behaviors, cribbing and weaving. So it should come as no real surprise that when you hand raise a a baby parrot, a very intelligent animal, that they might do the same thing. It's interesting because those things are illustrated in a number of other human things. We found out in the late 1960s that children who grew up in playpens developed dyslexia. And there may be other things that cause dyslexia. Not everybody who grew up in a playpen got dyslexia, but a very high percentage of children who grew up in playpens and walkers, starting as early as the late 1940s and into the mid-1960s, developed dyslexia. And that whole pandemic of dyslexia pretty much came to an end once they stopped letting people raise their children in a playpen. So you may notice if you go to Babies R Us today, you can't buy a playpen for your child. And even if you buy one of these little activity centers that you set your child in, there's a big sign on there not to leave them in there longer than a specific period of time. And the reason is that if you don't, is the act of crawling turns on the switch of something in your brain that makes that input of information and the way that it's handled different. And if it's not turned on, then you end up with dyslexia. And if it is turned on, you turn on more normal. And perhaps one of the most interesting things that that's happened recently, at least this was told to me, I haven't read the actual research, but I was told that in the early 2000s they discovered that that there's a developmental link to perfect pitch. And we used to think that people like Handel and Mozart, who had perfect pitch, and along with them being geniuses, turned out to be great, great composers, developed those behaviors just by a gift of God. They were just lucky enough to have perfect pitch. But we found out just recently, according to what I was told, that that everybody who grows up in a society where language is tonal, so countries like Vietnam or people who speak Mandarin Chinese, where the same word can mean totally different things depending on the tone that you say it in. I guess Mandarin has the 4 tones that you can say a word at, and that changes. That's part of the language and changes the, what a word actually means. That in those societies, everybody's got perfect pitch. So there's something about listening for pitch during a very specific time of development as an infant that turns on that characteristic of having perfect pitch. So people like Handel and Mozart, who had perfect pitch, both of who I understand had fathers who were musicians, professional musicians, must have been able to hear that, hear and listening for that tonality, and that turned on their trait for perfect pitch. So what we think happens in the case of birds and maybe some other animals who have these obsessive compulsive behaviors where they self-mutilate themselves is that they miss some critical developmental step when they're raised by a human and not raised by a pair of birds. And so not every bird who's hand-fed becomes an obsessive compulsive feather picker, and maybe not every obsessive compulsive feather picker was raised by hand, but the vast majority of feather pickers are hand-raised birds. The other thing there's other characteristics that maybe play a role, and one thing that we notice is that the birds who are the most, by species, who are the most prone to become self-mutilators or have feather destructive behavior are birds who are flocking species. So cockatoos and African greys and lovebirds and cockatiels, birds that are very likely in the wild to stay together in big social groups, are much more likely to end up doing these behaviors than birds like Amazon parrots and some of the larger macaws, poicephalus, like Senegal parrots and Myers and brownheads and redbellies. Those birds are highly unlikely to develop those behaviors. I don't think in my entire 30-year professional career I've ever seen a Pioneus parrot who is a feather picker. So there's something about those species that seems to protect them, and it's probably the fact that their social behavior is not nearly as complex as the ones who are very social flocking birds. So it's probably easier for those birds to miss that critical developmental step because they've got this highly developed, probably mostly instinctual social behavior that goes along with flocking. And if they miss that step, then that's what ends up leading to the problem that goes to feather destructive behavior. The other thing that we see that supports that belief is that when we treat these birds, if we cover the most social times in their lives with the medication that stops them from feather picking, then we're the most successful. So if you take a bird and give it, say, Haldol, which we'll get to, morning and night, give it to him first thing when he gets up in the morning and last thing before he goes to bed, he's more prone to feather pick at the end of his day than a bird who gets his haldol first thing in the morning and as soon as the owners get home from work, say. Because in the second case, we're covering the most social, interactive times in that bird's day. He's getting the peak of his medication when mom and dad are and the kids are home and they're interacting and eating dinner and doing social behaviors. Then giving it to him, say, 12 hours later when he gets it and then he goes to bed. And he's missing, he's peaking with his medication after the social behavior. So, so we kind of have an idea of maybe what the impetus is, the hand rearing, and that they maybe miss this developmental step that has something to do with social behavior. But the next question is kind of, well, why do they do it? Well, what we think is happening to these birds is something very similar to what happens to people who have cutting behaviors or obsessive compulsive piercing or obsessive compulsive tattoo behavior, or even people who do things like obsessive compulsive shopping, because what those people will tell you they're looking for is this feeling they get when they do it. Most of those people have real high anxiety issues, so they're suffering from this anxiety disorder, but when they cut themselves and they get that big dose of epinephrine caused by hurting themselves, their anxiety goes away. So I once had a client who had started cutting herself as a late teenager, something like 17, 18 years of age, and she told me that even in her 50s, that if she feels anxious, the first thing she thinks about doing is cutting herself. Even though she hadn't cut herself for 40 years, that her brain had learned this trick. The trick is that if you cut yourself, you're going to feel better. You can make that anxiety go away and you can feel better. So when she feels that sensation of anxiety, her brain suggests the solution. And the solution her brain knows is, if you hurt yourself, if you cut yourself, you're going to feel better. So despite the fact that she has medication that makes her feel better, she's got cognitive therapy or group therapy, she's got a psychiatrist, she's got a psychologist, she's done all these things for 40 years to help her not cut herself. Her answer is, if I feel badly, the first thing I think about doing is cutting myself. She also told me that some days I realize that I'm thinking about cutting myself and I haven't even really realized that I'm feeling anxious. So it kind of illustrates the power that these obsessive compulsive behaviors have over the individuals, whether it's a bird or it's a human, have. And so I think that, quite honestly, in most of these birds, it's anxiety. And the other thing that I think is a common observation from people who work with a lot of these birds is that if they're not medicated, these are anxious birds. If you put them in new situations, they're very fearful. They want to try and escape. They become aggressive because they constantly have that feeling that the shoe is going to drop. And when they get in that new situation, their little brain says, this is it. This is what I've been worrying about all the time. And when that guy touches me, it'll be the end, and yet when you get them medicated, those anxiety type behaviors seem to disappear. So of course we're putting them on drugs that are aimed at anxious behavior and anxiety. Diagnosis. Well, I think there's a lot of stuff written and a lot of stuff in the literature about proving what these birds do not have. And I can tell you that in my practice, we don't get quite as caught up on those things, but we kind of know that, I guess there's things that could mimic feather destructive behavior. Infectious diseases like beak and feather disease or polyoma that causes damage to feathers, skin infections, some birds, especially lovebirds, by the way, get a herpes viral infection. They get it commonly underneath their wings, and every time they get stressed out, this lesion comes back, and it could be confused with self-mutilation behavior. But they're different in that the self-mutilation lesions usually aren't painful, where the herpes lesions are painful. So we want to rule out, at least make sure that the bird's healthy. So we'll typically be doing a typical blood chemistry profile on them, make sure their liver and kidneys and things like that are working, because liver disease could contribute to unhealthy skin and kidney disease could cause problems. We want to make sure they don't have signs of infection or inflammation, so we'll do a CBC on them, make sure their white blood cell count's not high. They don't have other things that would make us think they had something like that. If they have obvious lesions like a self-mutilation lesion, we might look to see if it's infected or they have some sort of weird parasite. But the vast majority of these birds don't have anything that's like that. It's interesting too that these birds will, some of the birds who truly self-mutilate will have some remarkable lesions, but when you palpate them and look at them and things, they're not painful to the bird. And if you watch the bird, it's interesting, they don't typically work the center of their lesion where the skin's missing and they're bleeding and have scabs. What they work is the margin of their lesion. And I think what's happened to those birds is that they've realized that, a lot of them are birds who started out feather picking, and now they have no feathers on the area that's kind of their target area of choice to pick feathers on. I envision them having one little feather there, and they're trying to get at that feather to pluck it to get that little dose of epinephrine, and they accidentally pinch their skin. But when they pinch the skin, that has a crazy reaction compared to just pulling the feather. I mean, it hurts a lot more, and it gets a lot more of a result, and so they get a big dose of epinephrine. So then they suddenly become converts. Instead of just picking feathers, at least, they find that there's this huge advantage of pinching their skin. So even though they've got this big open lesion on their chest, most of those birds now what they're doing mostly is pinching the skin on the side of the lesion. And so the lesion gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it gets deeper and deeper because they're doing that. So we want to rule out the obvious other differential diagnoses, but once we feel comfortable that the birds have obsessive compulsive behavior, then we go more after that, because there's a lot of people out there who kind of claim to be a bird trainer, bird behavioralist. Oftentimes their credentials is that they owned a bird once. What I might throw in here now is a little bit on just maintenance and behavior. And I will be the first to tell you that I think that there's things you can do behaviorally that will help these birds. You can make their world more dynamic and have more responsible social interactions with the bird, and give them occupation. What I called in a paper that I wrote once, compelling occupation, things that bird is compelled to spend its time doing. I think things like foraging toys and chew toys and a big outside environment that has fresh air and sunshine and lots of space, interaction with normal sorts of bird peers, all those things may help, but much like people who are cutters or self-mutilators, those things alone are rarely, if ever, the answer. So I'm not saying that you should do them. I think that they should be done. I think that people who have birds like this should consult with a good, knowledgeable avian behavioralist, preferably one who's gone to college to understand those things and really knows what they're doing. I guess we ought to try to talk about treatment and prognosis. First of all, let's talk about prognosis. I think untreated, these birds continue this behavior. I think even with behavioral modification, they're probably likely to continue it. There's some exceptions. The exception is with monumental changes in these birds' lives, they commonly stop doing their behaviors for a period of time. And I can't tell you how often it is that I have a bird come and people tell me, I just adopted this bird, or I adopted this bird a few months ago, and he was in a horrid situation where he came from, and he had picked all his feathers out. And ever since he came to my house, he stopped picking his feathers. Well, that's a really common thing. The other thing we see is that if we have a bird who feather picks and we hospitalize him, move him into the hospital while we're getting him under control or something, those birds rarely will feather pick for a period of time. But once that bird becomes comfortable in its new condition and its new environment, they almost always go back to feather picking. Because just like that client of mine who spent 40 years under therapy, but still, she felt anxious. The first thing she thought about doing was cutting herself. These birds' brains will not forget about the fact that they have an answer to their anxiety, and the answer is pulling feathers or biting themselves and making a hole in themselves. So rarely, so I think untreated, the prognosis for these birds is bad, because they will continue feather picking. I think their anxiety situation gets worse and worse because anxiety begets anxiety. And sooner or later, most of these birds are destroyed because they can't live a normal, enjoyable, healthy life because their feather picking or self-mutilation is just out of control. I think treated, most of these birds have a good prognosis, and I would say in the old world species flocking birds like African greys, cockatoos, eclectus parrots, and that majority of birds who we see who are perhaps the most common feather picking, I think the prognosis is really good. I would say with haldol alone, haloperidol alone, we have close to a 90% success rate just with that drug. I think it's even better if they get some environmental and behavioral counseling as well, and people work on making those things better and better. But certainly I don't think that if a bird's owner can just dedicate themselves to giving their haldol to their bird and observing them, the majority of them do very well. The ones who don't, we have some other tricks up our sleeve as well, by the way, and we have some other drugs that we get to. We'll talk about those, and we either use combinations with haloperidol or we use some of those drugs alone, and I think we probably pick up another 2 or 3% of the birds. And then of course there's probably a small number of birds who just have gotten to the point where we really are challenged to making them happy, and fixing their problems may be impossible in some small percentage of them. But I would say easily over 9 out of 10 of these birds I think we can turn around and turn them into happy birds again. Yeah, so let's talk about the actual treatment itself. So what we do with the vast majority of these guys is we put them on haloperidol. The brand name of that drug for a long time was Haldol, although I think for the most part everyone uses the generic form of that drug today. It comes as a solution. It's 2 milligrams per ml, and it's water soluble, so you can be diluted just in water so that we match the dose to the size of the bird and the ability of the owner to give it its dose. We learned a long time ago that if we start a bird out on a dose that makes it overly sedated, which is possible by giving it too much, that the owners very often bail out on the treatment and won't continue on. The other thing that we understand about the drug is that it's absorbed very rapidly out of the upper GI tract. So when you give your bird Haldol, it's absorbed into the bloodstream real rapidly, and you get a peak in the drug concentration, and then that gets redistributed to other tissues, and so the drug dose comes down. So when we dose these birds, what we're looking for is a dose that will make them look sleepy about 15-20 minutes after they get their dose. And they should be sleepy for maybe as much as 20-30 minutes, but by an hour after the time they get their drug, they should be pretty much back to looking like their normal birds again. So what we usually try to do is we try and dilute the drug so that the starting dose is about 1/10 of a cc, regardless of whether it's a lovebird or it's a African gray or it's a Moluccan cockatoo. So once we have it diluted, we start at a conservative dose. So we're gonna shoot for something that's maybe on the lowish side of where we expect them to be, and we have people increase or decrease the dose as needed to get that behavior. So we're looking for that sleepy after about 15-20 minutes, and not sleepy for back to pretty much normal within an hour when they started. And typically, if it's diluted to that amount, regardless of the size of the bird, we can change it in 0.02 of a cc increments. So if you have the typical African gray who's getting 1/10 of a cc of the concentrate drug diluted 1-to-1, so it's half strength. Most of those guys start right at 1/10 of a cc. If you see no sleepiness, they're going to go to 0.12 for a couple of days. If they get no sleepiness after that, they're going to go to 0.14 for a couple of days. And if they get too big of a volume, we can always change the dilution on the drug so we get it back to a smaller volume to give the drug. If you've got the same thing, if you have a little peach-faced lovebird, say, who's self-mutilating, those birds we're going to dilute their drug about 1 to 10, but they're still going to start out with 1/10 of a cc, and if they're not sleepy, they're going to go up 2/100 of a cc, or up to 4 or 0.12 cc's, or up to, if that still doesn't work, they're going to go up to 0.14 cc's. If we turn them into zombies, which we really try not to do, but if we give it to them and they're asleep in 15 minutes and they don't wake up for 2 or 3 hours, then we usually have people skip a dose or two and go down 2/100 of a cc. So they'll go to 0.08 cc's or 0.06 cc's. And then if it gets too low, it's just hard to know how much drug you've gotten into a bird. If you're giving him like less than 0.05 of a cc, we'll re-dilute it again so they get something closer to 1/10 of a cc that they're giving to them. So, but once they get that dose, we're very successful in stopping them from picking, at least while the drug is in their system. In most species of parrots, we're getting between about 8 and 10 hours out of their Haldol. So if you're giving it to them in the morning, you can typically give it to them again about the time you get home from work, and they probably don't need it overnight because they're asleep. They're not being stimulated back into that state of anxiety. In the morning they get it again. By the way, people ask always, well, what about other drugs? What about, I've heard Prozac works on these birds, or I've heard Paxil works on these birds, or I've heard Valium works. Well, I think some of those drugs would work fine, and part of the problem with them is dosing. So I think there have been successes with Prozac, say, but the problem with Prozac is in the typical cockatoo or African gray, you have to give that drug at least 3 times a day. And in smaller species like a lovebird, you have to give it 4 times a day. So to try and medicate your lovebird every 6 hours or your Moluccan cockatoo every 8 hours becomes almost impossible. And if you don't maintain the drug level with those drugs, it doesn't work. So one of the great things about haloperidol is that you don't have to maintain a drug level for it to work. You just have to maintain it for the time that is the highest social contact for those birds. That's why it probably works so much better than those other birds. The Valium family of drugs also work, but they're even shorter lived, but they're sometimes great adjuvants, additions to the Haldol in birds who have real problems. So macaws, I think I said, do this a little bit. Some of the, especially the mini macaws, and some of the larger species of macaws are feather pickers, and they do not respond to Haldol quite as well as the old world birds do. Some of them do, and some of them do fine with just Haldol alone, but the rest of them, what we typically do is we'll give them a little boost with a little Xanax, a little alprazolam during the peak time. So typically they'll get it also twice a day, and it's only probably lasting 4 to 6 hours, but that little boost of the alprazolam seems to smooth those guys out, and we'd probably fix most of those guys. They are a little more challenging, no question about it, than the old world birds.
Cockatoo is a presentation of the Chloe Sanctuary for Parrots and Cockatoos, a nonprofit charity dedicated to the empowerment of captive parrots and public awareness.